Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye podcast. My name is Sean Maloney. I'm here today with my good friend and co-host, Dr. Bruno Fernandez. Bruno, welcome back.
Thank you, Sean. Glad to be here again.
Good. So we have an awesome guest today, someone I've spoken with in the past. And I know you're certainly excited to speak to as a fellow athlete, Randy Pierce. Randy, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me back, and good to meet you as well, Bruno.
Nice to meet you too, Randy.
Good. So, Randy, you're the president of 2020 Vision Quest. That is your official title, although I feel like you can put a lot of other titles after that, and we'll dive into some of those as we work our way through the show today. But I was hoping we could start off with just a brief discussion about the history of your eye disease. Like, what happened? What is your eye condition? When did you lose sight, etc.?
Sure. Right. Eye condition. Right. My eyes are apparently really healthy. Unfortunately, behind the eyes is where my problem is. Right. So my optic nerves are what are dead. But growing up through to the age of 21.99, I had normal sight and every expectation that was going to be the case. And then in the span of 2 weeks, I lost all of the sight in my right eye and half of the sight in my left eye. Very rapid. A great ophthalmologist got caught right away what was going on because the optic nerve is swollen. It's the only nerve you get to see from the outside, right? Looking through the pupil. And he got me into a neuro-ophthalmologist, and they quickly were aware that I was in some pretty big trouble. And they were able to take some steps to get it a little bit under control. My condition is episodic. So while that left me, legally blind, a term at the time I didn't even understand. In fact, I had a lot of misunderstanding that I was able to, steadily educate myself and now do some work educating others about. It eventually advanced as they somewhat expected. And over 7 episodes and 11 years, I went to the stages of total blindness where I am now, or sometimes I like to joke, right? I must be illegally blind since I'm beyond legal blindness. And that's where I am today, right? No light sensitivity, no motion. And the good part, I always want to follow up with that is that, going blind was plenty challenging, certainly plenty hard, but being blind isn't. And that's an important part of probably some of the discussions we'll have as we go forward.
And it's interesting you say that, right? Because most people would think, hey, the biggest fear is actually being totally blind. But it's that, I know you and I have talked about this before, that transition to blindness. There seems to be a lot of adaptations along the way, or you're holding on to hope, or you're holding on to trying to do things a certain way. But once you're totally blind, then it's, kind of like, hey, I've arrived. Now here's what I need to do, right?
I think it's true for everyone in any aspect of change, right? Change is hard for most people. And that's true for people in their change of their sight. And there were times as my sight got lower and lower that I remember wishing, well, maybe when it's all gone, I'll finally not have this, worry. So I almost wished for it. And the truth is, use every bit of sight you can as best you can. Use all the tools you can to the best effect. That's what I believe. Because when it was gone, it was a little harder. Those adaptations needed more work, and they mean different things. But there was also, just as you suggest, there's something about stability that says, okay, this is the framework from which I get to work, and everything will be consistent as I work forward, and the things I learn will always apply. So,
Randy, you seem to have a very strong mindset on dealing with your visual condition, and it's very impressive. Has it always been like that, or from the moment that you started to lose sight, did you doubt yourself? How was that transition? From a moment that you're probably fearful, and now you're so strong-minded.
Right. And the answer is that absolutely it was not always that case. And it is not always that case. And that's true, again, I think for everybody. We all have moments we're not as strong, right? I have days today that, I may get up and say, come on, blind again today, really? And that's okay because, right, challenge is hard. And, I think that's true of anybody with any condition, including life, where we get up some days and aspects of it overwhelm us, and we have to do the right self-care to make sure we're better and able to handle it. And the trick is, how long do you want to let it slow you down or stop you? That's sort of up to you, right? The sooner you change your mindset, the better. And that was true at the very start. When it first happened to me, I was not strong in my mindset. I felt a little helpless, a little hopeless. I thought everything fun and meaningful was not going to be possible in my life. And fortunately, as is more often than I'd like to admit in the world, I was wrong, right? Everything that I want to do is possible. The question is, how much am I willing to problem solve and work to make it happen? And if it's important to me, you bet I do that.
That's very impressive. Going back to the condition, have you ever received a formal diagnosis about the condition that affects your optic nerves?
I have, and that's really important. Like early days, they didn't have it, and the uncertainty, the unknown, is always a little more daunting and intimidating. And early on, any level of diagnosis made me feel better. Like the first time they called it optic neuritis made me feel a little better, which that just means my nerves are swollen and dying. But what they have learned is that I have a unique mitochondrial disease. They can see it when they ran my genome. In fact, they actually ran my genome twice because they'd never seen the variants that I have. But they can see the 2 points, right? Variants instead of mutations. That's the politically correct term. But the mitochondrial at the cellular level for me is slightly distorted, and nerves, starting with my optic nerves, but actually all over my body, die. And about every 3 to 5 years, a new set of nerves begin to die. I don't have nerves below my knees. I don't feel my shins, my calves, my feet. My vasal nerve, which controls your autonomic functions, took some impact in 2016, right? So I have ongoing challenges every few years. My optic nerves were just the first ones. And honestly, they're probably the least impactful to me because I've had the most time to learn how to work around them.
So, I'm going to touch back on something you were just saying, how, it really boils down to how much do you want to adapt, or how much do you want effort do you want to put into continue doing things, because you realize that you can basically do just about everything that you could do before with perfect vision. And I think it's a nice segue into talking a little bit about your running career, because you have accomplished, well, I like to run too, but I've never run the Boston Marathon. I've never qualified for that. It's hard enough to do whenever you can see where you're running. Can you talk a little bit about your running career and maybe some of the the highlights, including the training for beating the Boston?
Sure. And running, like anything, like these times in COVID, when you have something that you lose, you really learn to appreciate it and the value. Like when I lost my sight, I really began to appreciate the value of vision. And my nerve condition for a while took away my ability to walk, not because of my eyes, but because of the damage to my cerebellum that put me in a wheelchair for 1 year, 8 months, and 21 days. And in that case, I was able to work my way out of that through a lot of processes. And when I began to walk again, I realized what a gift it is. And I began to, walk in as many exciting places as possible. That led to hiking. Getting in better shape to hiking led to running. And as I did that, I began to learn that as a runner, I was actually reasonably more gifted than I anticipated. And, I ran a lot of road races early on, including, I ran a race in 2013 called the Boston Athletic Association 5K. It's the day before the Boston Marathon back then, same finish line. And I ran that race with my guide dog, first time a guide dog had ever done that. And when we crossed the finish line, they took a photo of us crossing the finish, celebrating ability awareness, right? Which is what I believe in, right? What you can do is always more important than what you can't do. So celebrate your ability. Don't put the focus on disability. Put the focus on what's important, what you can do. And if there's something you can't do and it's important, well, that's where you start getting into the notion of, believing and problem solving and achieving. But running was one example, right? I was there running, and at that time I ran both with my guide dog and also with human guides. But we crossed that finish line and we were celebrating this moment, and they shared that on their social media. Again, great moment. But they shared it the day after we ran, the day of the 2013 Boston Marathon. And just as I was, sharing that with my friends, the bombs went off and ripped that flag display that's in our photo apart. And what that shares with us, right, is the reality that when people don't communicate well and when people don't resolve differences well, awful things can happen. And what do you do again? Well, some of the lessons I learned in my transition of sight, you put your focus forward. And that's where I really said, I want to do more with this running. First off, I said, I want to elevate up to the Boston Marathon because I'm going to run that, because I want to respond with hope. And I want to join a community that says we celebrate the elite human spirit, not just the elite human athlete, because that's a part of Boston. And in the journey to do that, it actually took me, I thought I was going to do it that next year, but I had a tough journey. My guide dog had osteosarcoma, bone cancer on his skull, and I lost my boy that year. And I dedicated a lot of time to him instead of training and qualifying and all of that. But the next year, I dedicated the year to him. And that's where I discovered that in that training process, now relying on people instead of guides, I started working out a new technique for running. I use a rigid tether. A lot of people use a soft tether that helps me as a totally blind athlete manage all the different terrains on the road, manage my size because I'm a bigger guy. I'm 6'4", 200 pounds. And that means I take up more room. So how can I get narrow, right? So we started solving all these problems. And on that journey, I started appreciating that I had good speed. And the more you practice, the better you get at everything, right? I like the expression, not practice makes perfect, but practice makes progress. And I got invited by Richard Hunter, an incredible man. He brings blind runners from all over the world together at the California International Marathon. And he said, I think you're going to compete and do well out here. And I went out there in December that year, and I won that first race. And there were some fun stories about that. But that set me up, for one year later than expected to get into my first Boston Marathon and run with a pair of friends, a husband and wife team. The husband ran the first half and the wife guided me for the second half. And, my first Boston Marathon, I think, was 3:50:37, 3 hours, 50 minutes and 37 seconds. And I felt great at the end of that. And I've had some bad marathons too, right? Because it's hard. But all the time I start learning the power of teamwork, right? How much we bond and work together. That's true with my guide dogs. That's true with the people that I train with. And that's an extra part of the experience that, as a person who needs a guide to run, I get out of that. And that's something they get out of it too. I could go in a lot more on that little gem with a story or two, but let me turn it back over to you so I don't take too much time on you.
That's amazing. Like, it's still on your athletic achievements there. It's something that interests me a lot. Hiking, right? So you besides like those marathons, like you're very much into hiking, and I'm gonna follow up on the Mount Kilimanjaro hike, but I'm interested also on your challenge of hiking 48 peaks in the state of New Hampshire, and you did that over the course of one season only, was it right?
Yeah, one winter actually. So I've climbed them a couple of different times, and one particular winter in 2011 into 12, we took a 3-month window to do all of them during that winter season, because it's something that's rarely done for people, in general, to be able to do them in the winter or even to do them in one winter. So in an effort to try to raise awareness for a lot of the things I believe in, I set out to do that, but I was sort of taking it a little bit easier on myself, because while I have climbed them now in the all season time, which by that I mean in the summer, where it's more challenging, because the twisty, rocky, rooty, where do you put your foot steps of the summer are actually my biggest challenge. And in the winter, I have new challenges because I may lose sensitivity in my hands to gloves. I may lose my hearing to hats, but the snow fills in all those tricky footings and it becomes smooth. And it may be slick, it may be icy, but I can wear devices on my feet that cover that, right? So you give up the biggest challenge, even though you add some new problems. So winter lets me be faster. So doing them all in that one season maybe had a little bit of benefit to me as well. But still, by all measures, an accomplishment I'm very proud of.
No, exactly. And I mean, just doing a quick math there, it's almost like you hiked a mountain every other day.
Huh. And to some extent, right? So, 48 peaks and you've got 90 days roughly, right? So You're absolutely right. But the trick is sometimes you're doing a couple of mountains on the same day. And,
all right.
There's a bonds traverse in the winter where, because you're going out into the wilderness, you go out and you get 4 peaks, but you're doing a 24.5 mile day.
Yeah.
So you're putting some work in.
And also, like, I mean, it might not be as known as sexy as Everest or Kilimanjaro, but I once heard that it's actually the White Mountains are actually quite treacherous because of the ever-ending. I mean, the weather seems to shift unexpectedly, right?
Absolutely. And, there's two parts to that, right? I'm not a risk taker. I'm a problem solver. And I try to highlight the difference, right? I'm a risk manipulator because there's risk in everything we do. And the trick is to understand what are acceptable levels of safety and how can you get things to that point. And in the whites, one of the things that gets a lot of people in trouble and causes a lot of those challenges, they're very accessible. You can drive to areas where almost anybody can make an attempt on them. And that leads people to think there's a level of security. It's so quick to get to, quick to get out of, but then they get up into there and they don't realize how quick the weather can change and how quick they can make a wrong turn that gets them into the depths of a wilderness, that it is not easy to get up to them, to get them rescued. And hypothermia kills people in July, often in the White Mountains, because we're going to have snow here tomorrow, and significant snow probably in those mountains, and people just don't anticipate that. And lack of education is what does people a lot of harm in the hiking world. And, right, probably lack of education does what some of us sight impaired people a lot of detriment, right? When we're talking about, trying to get jobs, trying to get advocacy, all of those things. But the reality is in the mountains, it's deadly for people. And I worked with search and rescue on a project, and I asked them, hey, as close as you're following me, should I be concerned that you're worried about me? They said, no. We see that you're solving problems and you're approaching this with an education and a preparedness. You're not the kind of person we have to worry about. And that doesn't mean I don't keep those precautions up, but because the risks are there. But if you do the right things, and when your risk factors start climbing, you back out. And I'm more proud of the hikes that I said, hey, we need to turn around because the risks are getting unreasonable, than the hikes that I pushed through, which happened a few times, especially early, and maybe took risks that could have made things uncomfortable or unsafe.
Yeah, that's wise. And getting to Mount Kilimanjaro now, was that your highest peak?
So yes, in the Andes, I got close to it on a couple of hikes while we were down there, but 19,341, the air is pretty thin up there.
Yeah.
You're on a pillar of the earth, and, they tell you to be ready. You're taking one breath for every step because you can't get enough oxygen to your muscles, which had an interesting effect on my guides because they couldn't speak to give me instructions. There was this really kind of dramatic moment on the summit. I write about it in my book, but I brought the ashes of my pup up because he had guided me to so many mountain peaks, and he had passed away before we climbed it. And I brought some of his ashes up to bury on the summit. And we were up on the summit for about a half hour, which is a little longer than you really want to stay up in that low oxygen. And when it's time to head back, the guides that are leading our group say, it's time to go. And I said, okay, who's ready to guide me? And nobody answers. And, we got a team of my friends there that, they were all splitting the chores to try to make it easier. And I said, okay, who's willing to try? And nobody answers. And I'm like, okay. I pause. I kind of look in the direction I think our overall guides are because they can't lead me. And I say, all right, who can hear me? And I get a bunch of, yep, I can hear you. I'm like, well, we got a problem here. I have to get off this mountain. And, one of my best friends said, I can give it a try, but I don't have much left. And, obviously every step down, the breaths get a little easier. So we were able to work it out. But it was kind of a funny and scary moment.
That's that's a good story that you got there in that sense. You talked about your book. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit. Your book is called "See You at the Summit," and what drove you to write the book, and what message are you really trying to get across to the readers?
Sure. No, the great questions, and thank you for that. So I do a lot of presentations, right? I do them, from the corporate level to all levels of schools. And after I present, one of the most common questions I have is, why don't you write a book, or do you have a book? Because people want to know all the answers to how did I develop the mindset I have? How do I develop the tools that I have to do all the things that I want to do? And, it's hard to answer that, right? These podcasts are great opportunities, but we're going to scratch the surface of all the things that are involved. And I said, those are great questions, and a book is a daunting task. But I love challenges, right? I embrace it. I call it positive adversity. Make the goals in your life that are the challenge that will be the catalyst to make you grow. And writing the book was that catalyst to answer those questions for people. So it's my life story. That the book is See You at the Summit, but its subtitle is My Blind Journey from the Depths of Loss to the Heights of Achievement. And the loss of my sight is obviously included in that, but that's not the hardest loss of my life. And the hardest loss of my life are all the pieces that helped lead me to have the strength and the skills that I practice, because all of these things, they aren't just gifts that we get. They are things that we develop and we practice and we hone if we want to have resiliency to carry ourselves through all the challenges of life, because we're all going to face them. And that was the hope of my book, that I'd share my story and maybe leave some guides for people, some guide points on how they might approach some things with a little bit of an insight from a blind guy, right? My vision of how we can all, interact with the world in maybe a better way.
Yeah, that's very useful. I can tell our experience because I'm a martial arts teacher, right? And I had the pleasure of teaching people with disabilities already, like physical, mental learning. And I also teach a lot of able people, and those are the hardest ones to motivate sometimes, because they have those self-imposed perceived limitations that I just can't get out of their heads.
Right.
So besides your written engagement there and the book you've published already, you're also a very active keynote speaker, and I heard that your next engagement, I think, will be a talk at the Canadian Ophthalmological Society in June. So can you advance it, like what the message you're willing to share, like on that talk?
Sure. I'll probably have a couple of keynotes between now and then, actually, because they come in pretty regularly, and I've got a collegiate commencement to give as well before then. But that message, right? I think there's a powerful thing. I have such a great deal of admiration and respect for what the eye doctors of the world, what the ophthalmologists of the world can do for us, because I respect what our eyes and the health of them allows. And I respect especially, right, my own sight was saved for 11 years beyond what it might have been because of a doctor who was quick thinking. And I love that. But they know that part. What I want to share with them is some of the other powers that are within their grasp. And it's the power, right? It's courage, compassion, and connection. I really believe in it. It's right. It's the seas beyond the sea. And what that is how to help people get connected with all the other sources that will complete their life, right? Because my eye health was only one part of that. And the mental, emotional, and the physical skills that I would need to be a whole person of health when I lost my sight and when I was losing my sight is a step that we can be better at connecting. And that simply involves that connection point between the ophthalmologist and the service trainers that help us gain those skills. That process, the better they start working as a team, and so teamwork will be a little bit of a theme, the better that teamwork works to help somebody who's probably not going to be in the best state because there's a little bit of emotional trauma and turmoil during transition for somebody losing their sight. So the more those teams can advocate to work together to bring that person to see those opportunities for themselves, the better that transition will be. And I think that's one of the number one opportunities to help people have a clearer vision for a better life.
So just maybe building on that point a little bit, Randy, if you were in the position where you were giving physicians or patients, the other side of that equation, any advice, let's say immediately after someone gets diagnosed with a blinding eye condition, what might you tell the clinician that they can do, and what might you tell the individual who's being diagnosed? And maybe we can dive in a little bit into mindset on that, because that seems to be kind of the ace in the hole here. I find in everything we're talking about it, with mindset, about being able to attack this problem in a certain way. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I do, and it's not a linear solution, right? Because every patient might be at a different point in their mindset, and there are so many things that could intimidate them and so many things that might resonate for them, and it's hard to judge those things. So knowing what is that right connection point. I speak to people who are new to sight loss on a regular basis because they get referred to me all the time. And the first thing I have to find out is where they are, and that's a hard read sometimes. And honestly, that's not what most ophthalmologists are going to be trained to do. So I'd love if there was some easier integration between the ophthalmological offices and the centers for sight services to have one of the social workers that is trained for that to be at quick call and access to get to those offices to be able to speak with those patients and provide the free consults that are most places do to say, hey, this is really overwhelming right now. And we just want to let you know that we can help resolve and take it down to whelming, right? We can help give some of those solutions, and there's a process. And what's that right stage? They need to help find that and work to that. And in regards to the patients, right, a lot of these agencies, have a name like, Association for the Blind. And boy, if somebody's losing a little sight, they hear that and they're like, oh, I'm not going blind, am I? So boy, a doctor doesn't necessarily want to expose that. So how do you manage by knowing where that person is in the fear of what might not be coming, right? You don't want to make them think something worse than is reality, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they're not missing tools, low vision aids that could truly augment their sight. The number of times somebody a little older who just wants to read a paper or a book like they've done every day of their life, or see a grandchild's picture, but they're so afraid of accessing anything that could help them. And I'm not even just talking about technology. It could even be a lit magnifying arm piece that could go over their printed material. But they don't have access to that, and they don't know that it exists or the right formats. And how do we do that? Well, there are trained professionals, and making sure that teamwork and integration can be there to kind of gauge that patient in the right way and introduce that patient in a gentle way.
I think that's, you hit on a few good points there. And those are some things that have come up in conversations in the past, personally and through the podcast, and in that piece that's missing between, maybe what the patient's experiencing and what the doctor can provide. And I understand why that gap is there, right? So I think that those types of services being readily accessible and easy to find would be phenomenal. 2020 Vision Quest, where can people learn more about the organization and what you guys are doing? So
I love, our website is a one-stop connection to a lot of different other sources, and our website is 2020visionquest.org. But we're on all sorts of social media, Facebook and Twitter, and we have a YouTube channel, and we're everywhere that you can find this podcast. I hope, and that'll link you to our book, which is an ebook. It's on Audible, and we try to be out there and very accessible to people, because here's my real perspective is that I went through this journey and I had some great encouragement and mentorship and motivation and support. And I love my life as a result. And we certainly want to be that resource for people in the visual community, the sight loss community, but also just in anybody can learn to be reaching for their peak potential. How can we be better people, better than we were yesterday, better tomorrow than we are today? And we think we've learned a lot of things about that. We want to share that because we want to build a better world.
Randy, I think I'm going to be sitting and listening to this podcast. The stats are going to go up. I'm going to download 10,000 times for the next year. Those days where I'm like, hey man, blind again. Yeah, it's the same like you said. Just to get fired up. It'd be tough to not feel like you just had a triple espresso after listening to this. So, listen, thanks so much for doing this. This is awesome. We certainly hope to be able to get you back for a round 2 at some point, because we can dive deeper into some of these other stories. And I think I'd just like to say thank you from my perspective personally, but also on behalf of all the listeners for sharing your stories.
Well, thanks for what you're doing with the Broad Eye and with your lives. Let's keep doing the work we're doing and making this world better and expanding everybody's vision.
Randy, thank you so much for chatting with us. It's very inspiring, like, to me, to chat with people like you, and I agree that your message, like, is important not only for people with visual deficiencies but for everybody. It's very inspiring, like, to hear what you've accomplished and your energy as well.
Well, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you. And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.